I'm Carrie Michael, and you're listening to Speak Up Arkansas on KABF 88.3 FM. Arkansas Employment First is a philosophy that all people with disabilities who are of working age or transition age youth should have opportunities to work in their own communities in an integrated setting for competitive wages. Proponents of Employment First say that this approach ensures that people with disabilities receive better wages, better benefits, improved health, and a better quality of life. No longer accepting that sheltered workshops for sub-minimum wages are acceptable employment outcomes for folks with disabilities, Employment First advocates say that this approach is about raising expectations for what is possible and desirable for people with disabilities, and that with the right supports, people with disabilities can enjoy fulfilling careers and contribute to the economy of their communities. One of the most important supports for people with disabilities to live and work in their communities is the direct support professional. Direct support professionals, or DSPs, provide direct care to the individuals they support so that those individuals are able to live and work in the least restrictive environment possible. DSPs are hardworking folks. They help teach, guide, and support basic activities of living and help support an individual's mental and physical health. They do an incredibly important job that requires a wide range of skills. But DSPs don't get a lot of support themselves. They're underpaid, overworked, and receive very little investment in the way of training and professional development, despite their important role. What are we doing to ensure that people with disabilities have the support they need to pursue the same employment opportunities that those without disabilities enjoy? People with disabilities in the workforce and the people who support them. That's our topic on today's episode of Speak Up Arkansas. We're excited to be a part of KABF's weekly Speak Up Arkansas program to encourage dialogue about the issues that matter most to people with disabilities, their families and caregivers, and to educate the public about these issues, to make Arkansas a truly inclusive state where everyone's personhood and contributions are valued. The show is pre-recorded, so we won't be taking calls, but we welcome your questions and comments. Give us a call at 800-482-1174, or you can find us online at www.disabilityrightsar.org. We're also on Facebook at Disability Rights AR and on Twitter at DR Arkansas. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to introduce to you our today's panel. With us today, we have Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan is the Executive Director of the Arkansas Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. And we have back with us again, Sarah Evans, a frequent guest of the show. She's a frequent flyer, CEO of Arkansas Support Network, and President of the Arkansas Waiver Association. Thank you both so much.
Having me.
I know we got a lot to cover and no shortage of information and opinions on the part of this panel. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Jonathan, I'd love to start with you. Tell us a little bit about Employment First. Is it right to call it a movement?
Yeah, I think it is. In some states, it's moved from movement to legislation. In other states, it's policy. In other states, it's preference. In Arkansas, I would say it's a movement that's based in an executive order and a preference that we would like to see move into actual legislation.
Gotcha. Okay, so tell us about sort of the background of what the priorities of this movement in Arkansas specifically are. What historically hasn't happened that needs to happen that you all are working towards in terms of policy change?
Sure. It really got started in 2010. And that was where, the governor initially moved towards looking at what would happen if we became an employment first state. And then that moved along into 2012, it became an executive order, 10-17, where it made employment the preferred option for people receiving some sort of government assistance in their everyday life. So that's where it was started. So in 2012, we had the executive order, and that formed an Employment First task force, which led to a white paper, a research paper that talked about what the panel thought should actually happen. And of course, the recommendation was Employment First should be made into law. so that any sort of state agency that was providing people with disabilities some form of assistance should make employment the first option. And here's what I mean by the first option. If I were receiving some sort of assistance when I'm sitting down with my counselor going through the process of person-centered planning, the question should be, John, what would you like to do for a living? That should be the question. And that's the question, by the way, that anybody getting ready to go into the workforce is asked. Hey, what do you want to do for a living? If you had asked me when I was 18 years old, I would have told you I wanted to be a police officer because I'd seen Lethal Weapon 10 times. So I was therefore qualified to be a police officer at that point. And of course, went through college, learned a few things and learned that I wasn't, but that was the first question. They assumed that I wanted to work. The way it works now is, would you like to work? Not what would you like to do, but would you? And Employment First would, mandate that you ask the question of, what do you want to do? That should be the first option. And it should be the preferred option of anybody receiving some sort of services, is to give them the ability to enter the workforce with whatever level of support they happen to need at that time.
That feels like it should be uncontroversial, but I get the feeling that that would actually be a really big paradigm shift to change the question being asked.
Yeah, you would think that it's just a basic thing. This is the United States. Why doesn't everybody want to work? You think about it, when you meet somebody new, that's almost one of the first questions that you ask is, hey, what do you do for a living? Mm-hmm. It's normal. And, unless you are, a young child, and you can't work, or you're of retirement age, if your response is, I don't work, that opens up an entirely different perception of you as a person. So yeah, having a job is eccentric to being a citizen in the United States. Here's a statistic for you, and I've got lots of them. In fact, I'll ask you the question. How much of your life do you think you spend at work, on average?
I mean, I'd have to say that, I'm sad to say, but I'd have to say the vast majority of my life is spent working or doing Sayard.
Well, and some of us more than others.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm sure the workaholics are on this side of the bell curve, but
it's
on
working.
Average, it's a third of your life you spend at work.
It feels like more, but there's the work, and then also kind of all the activities that, and Sarah, we'll get into this in a bit, but like kind of the activities that prepare you for work, or that support your being at work or being able to work.
Well, think about this though. If you spend a third of your life at work, there is an entirely different social universe that you encounter because you're working. You make friends at work. You learn things at work. I met my wife at work. So if you are not part of the working universe, you are shut off of an entirely different part of your life that you could have access to. And that, that too is part of the Employment First movement, is that not only should you be able to work, but you should be able to have that same experience that the rest of us have working, learning new skills, meeting new people, maybe going to other parts of the country with your job, are all part of working in the United States. And so something just as basic of what would you like to do is the first step in that journey that the rest of us have had for our entire life. Some of us have been working since we were teenagers.
Oh yeah, and since I've been, I guess since before I was legally able to work, babysitting and doing all kinds of things. So kind of staying on that theme, and I know it's kind of jumping ahead a little bit, and I want to kind of get back to some of this foundational stuff, but advocates say that the outcomes for people with disability, well, and I guess you could arguably say outcomes are better for people without disabilities when they're in, working as well. But that outcomes are better when they're in the least restrictive environment. That's something that comes up a lot in this discussion. What does that mean? And when they say that the outcomes are better, specifically what sorts of outcomes are we looking at?
Okay. So, when you say least restrictive environment, that all got started mostly in education, through the Individuals with Disability and Education Act. And at its most basic, a least restrictive environment for a student in education would mean you should be in the classroom with your peers as much as humanly possible to achieve your educational goals. So when you transfer that concept over to employment, think about, all right, well, what does that mean, least restrictive employment or least restrictive environment at work? It means something different for everybody else. But at its most fundamental, a least restrictive environment for somebody with a disability means that they should be working with peers without a disability. They shouldn't be exclusively back of house, or a least restrictive environment should be in a team with other people without disabilities that matches their current level of skill and ability. Let me put it another way. Somebody with a disability should not be part of a sub-team or an enclave that is restricted to back of house, only working with other people with disabilities. They should be integrated, not restricted.
Seems simple enough.
Yeah, that means different things for different people. When you think about least restrictive environments, somebody who's on their first day of the job probably should not be running the company by the end of the week. It's whatever the best environment that matches their skill set at that time is where they should be. And they should not be restricted by misconceptions or myths or misperceptions by their boss that says, well, based on your disability, you should be over here doing this because this is what I think. A least restrictive environment, an employer would look at them and say, well, based on your current level of ability, this is what you should be doing.
Gotcha. Okay. So in addition to this concept of least restrictive environment, another, set of tenets that Employment First emphasizes a lot in the white papers, in the literature that I've read, is that competitive and integrated employment is preferable. Sort of the integration, I mean, if I'm understanding that right, you've already hit on, which is that the working environment is one that is integrated. It's not, people with disabilities and people without are working together in an environment, just like, so many of us work with lots of different people in our environment. That's not super complicated. Tell us then about, but it's not just integrated, but also competitive. Say more about that.
Yeah, I'll go through the whole concept.
Awesome.
The competitive part, when people first hear competitive, they're assuming that it's a competitive employment process. When we talk about the competitive piece, we're talking about wages. So when we talk about competitive, we mean if I have a disability and I'm working, based on my level of skill and experience, I should be making the same as somebody else who doesn't, in theory, have a disability. So it's wage-based, not how you got the job. And just as a bit of a tangent, sure, there are lots of people out there listening that filled out an application and got their job. But there are many people out there that, well, I knew somebody and I had a reference and that's how I got in the door. It's no different for somebody with a disability to get a job that way too. So when we talk about competitive, we're talking about wages, which should be at least minimum, if not prevailing for that particular job or industry or location. The integrated part we already touched on, but that person with a disability should not be off in a corner or only working by themselves or only with other people with a disability. They should be there with coworkers that don't have a disability. They should be fully part of that team and not hidden away somewhere. The employment part of it refers to where that payroll is coming from. So I'll give you an example. If somebody comes to your work environment and they're there as part of maybe an internship or a job training program, they might be making competitive wages. They might be integrated during that experience, but if they're not fully employed by you, that doesn't meet the full definition of competitive integrative employment. But once that person's paycheck comes from the same place as everybody else working there, then it's truly competitive integrative employment. So prior to me coming on to the council, I worked for TJ Maxx. That's the same company that owns TJ Maxx and Marshalls. And I hired many people with disabilities, whether it be a physical disability or an intellectual or developmental disability, through collaborations with different state agencies, Arkansas Workforce Services and Rehab Services. And at the beginning, they would sometimes come on and their payroll would be supported externally. So they were being paid competitively, they were integrated into my team, but they weren't fully employed by me. When that work program ended, if their performance was good, I did everything I could to bring them on board and make them fully mine. They were my employee at that point. And that's all competitive integrative employment is. They're making the same wages, they're working with everybody else, and their paycheck comes from the same source. That's it.
So I'm going to ask the two of you this question, and Sarah, I'd love to hear from you on this too. Why isn't this happening? Like,
I'll let Sarah go.
Well, first off, let me say, just to add just a little bit, John did a great job of the technicalities of all of that lingo that we kind of build this platform of having conversations about employment first. But it's really important to understand the necessity for that language. When we start to define employment first, we've been really intentional about defining restrictive environment and defining competitive integrated employment and couching those as our milestones and our markers, because in our service industry we have a long history of engaging in activities kind of on the basis of recognizing and understanding the social benefits of work and recognizing the identity benefits of work, but doing so in a way that's really demeaning and disrespectful and harmful to folks with disabilities, exploitive even. And so our traditional structure of vocational service historically has been in models that look at putting people in environments where they have kind of the social connectedness of a work environment that maybe even gives them the responsibilities of the labor associated with work environments, but doing so in a way that's kind of deemed a service or a support to them, really kind of stripping them of the value and even in some instances the humanity that they possess, and doing so at sub-minimum wage reimbursements in ways that are contractually beneficial for the providers of those services, but don't really protect the rights of people with disabilities in those settings. And so the intentionality of the Employment First strategy in making sure that we are very clearly defining things like least restrictive environments and competitive integrative employment are really important, not only to understand what those are, but to understand why they are, right? Why we need to make sure that we're holding those up as pillars. And that why of our history, for me, is also the why of why this isn't happening, right? That you're talking about a service industry that has routinely and historically for centuries devalued the people that we're supporting in a way that we're not just trying to tackle the practicalities of tapping into an untapped workforce. I always love to hear John talk about his experiences in retail. I oftentimes refer to John as the best kind of believer. He's a converted believer. He came to this field after having success in really recognizing that, man, hiring folks with disabilities is a good business move. And he had that experience and he's been able to apply it. But a lot of the folks that are driving our industry today are the original kind of born into this faith tradition, and they've been here for a really long time, and they don't necessarily have the enthusiasm, the excitement, or the experience of innovation in our field. And so sometimes the answer to why is this not happening is us, is the fact that the system that we are working within is a long-standing system that we're trying to nudge and we're trying to push to more progressive places. But it is a Titanic. It is a big infrastructure that can be difficult to change. And anybody that knows me knows this is kind of the way I think about the world in general. But sometimes I think that the approaches and the strategies that we take, we try to kind of nudge small changes into a big change direction when really what we need is just a little bit of revolution on some fronts and some areas, and finding an opportunity to be radical in the changes that we're putting forth. I certainly know where I am, and I know the systems I'm working within, and I know we're not there yet. But I do think that the why of our history is still anchoring us in the why of this not happening today.
I love it when we talk about revolution on this show. John, thoughts? How are you going to follow that up?
Oh gosh, well, as usual, and thank you for saying that, Sayed. When you talk about my conversion, it was not an overnight thing. Whenever we talk about overnight conversion, I always think about, you ever see how the Grinch, he's standing at the top of the mountain and like his heart grows 3 sizes that day. It didn't happen to me overnight. I really started practicing this maybe about 10 years ago. And if you had told me 10 years ago when I was, a store manager for TJ Maxx, that I'd be sitting here talking about the benefits of hiring people with disabilities, I'd have told you were out of your mind, because I was one of those, old school, probably standing on the top of that, iceberg and Titanic that we're trying to move out of the way, because I wouldn't have believed it. If you told me that, well, if somebody who's coming to work has to have a coach working there with them, they're just not ready to work. If I have to check in with their parents on a regular basis, that's a helicopter parent. They're not ready to work. And I just didn't believe it. So if you want to jump back 10 years ago, that's when the Promise Grant program came out. That program, it looked at people with disabilities and their families who had been on benefits for multiple generations. And so they took that most current generation and said, what would happen if we introduced them to the world of work? What would happen? And so it was externally funded. And so they came to me and they worked for me for a summer. Now, all I heard at the beginning of that program was you're going to have lots of people working for you for free. That's all I heard. Free labor. That's all I heard. And so a whole bunch of young people, put them into my receiving area, and lost almost all of them by the end of the summer, because I was operating under some basic assumptions that much of the rest of the workforce undergoes. So let me give you a basic example, and I'll ask both of you this. Did your parents work? Carrie, did your parents work?
I had one parent outside the home that worked.
Okay.
And the
what
other
about grandparents? Did your grandparents work?
Yes.
Sayed, what about you?
I am the daughter of a 3rd-generation dairy farmer.
Yes. So you know work. All right. So when you went to your first job, did you get any sort of sage wisdom or advice from those people about what to do or not to do at work?
I for sure, I had advice not only about what to do, when I showed up at work, but kind of the process of finding employment. I had a great deal of
Yeah, I don't
support.
think that I got direct support or advice, but I got probably from the time I was 4 onward up, a lot of conditioning about
for sure
how to work and what the expectations of work were.
And you show up on time, and you don't just not go and all that. Yeah.
That's 2. Show up on time, actually show up to work, do what you're told, or at least never tell your boss that you're bored, because they'll find something harder for you to do. Things like that, all of those things that those of us that come from, a generational history of work knew what to do. None of those initial group of students had any idea of any of that. And so that really challenged my notions of what it meant to be a good employer. I just assumed that everybody knew these basic things. They didn't. So that's really what started me on that journey of, all right, going back to basics and making sure that everybody, regardless of whether they had a disability or not, was given the same level of basic training. That we didn't just talk about what we wanted you to do, but we talked about why you wanted to do it. And by doing that, it made my entire store leadership team better, because we were better and able to explain how to do that job. And by the end of that program, it didn't matter if somebody had a disability or not. We really understood what the training needed to be for them to be successful in our environment. And by the way, any employers that are out there that are listening, what I found was people with disabilities that I brought them on board, their retention rate was better. Their attendance was superior, if not the same, and their productivity, and this was a huge challenge for me. It's like, you know what, they're not going to be as productive, but that's okay. Productivity is a range. Those people with a disability showed up on time, if not early, with a good attitude, and worked just as hard, if not harder than anybody else. And so that time with Promise, particularly with younger people, just absolutely shattered my assumptions of what somebody with a disability could be capable of when you treated them just like everybody else. And that was a big part of it. The other part you talk about with what's holding you back, there's all sorts of myths that employers have in their head about how dangerous it's going to be to your bottom line to hire somebody with a disability. So I'll give you an example. So like workman's comp, my workman's comp is going to be higher because I hired somebody with a disability. No, it's not. Workman's comp, for those of you that don't know, is based on the inherent levels of risk in the job itself. Workman's comp is not based on each individual employee you hire. So hiring somebody with a disability is going to do nothing to your workman's comp. So that's not going to eat into your bottom line. The flip side of workman's comp is liability insurance. Oh, my liability is going to go up for my business. No, it's not. Liability is based on your third parties that come into your business. So in the retail universe, liability isn't my employers. Liabilities are customers that happen to come in the building and injure themselves. Has nothing to do with an employee that happens to have a disability. Or you'll get another fun one. Oh, I'm going to have to make all sorts of accommodations to this person. Okay, I'll give you an example of, and these are all real examples. Somebody with a wheelchair came in to work in an office. Okay, well, guess what? That desk wasn't high enough. $10 later, a 2x4 from Lowe's, a saw and a drill elevated that desk up so that they could get their wheelchair under and function just like anybody else. It was nothing. Or sometimes accommodations are just based on things like scheduling. So if you have somebody with a disability that doesn't drive, okay, for whatever reason, maybe it's a mobility device, maybe it's just for whatever reason they can't drive, they're dependent on mass transit. They have to take the bus. Well, the bus schedule is not an exact science. So I had somebody that worked for me that took the bus. You know, her job really just needed her to be there at 7, but I had enough people that started at 7 that I could bring her in at 8. And so she got there a little early because the bus was actually on time. Great. If not, well, she still wasn't late. Her job wasn't in jeopardy because of attendance, just because we pushed her up to 8 o'clock. And that really challenged me to go back and look at core job descriptions. Many employers will tell you that, well, I wrote those job descriptions and they are therefore written in stone. Well, I promise you they're not. Now, your core job functions, you know what your core job functions are. Okay? So for example, if I wanted to go be a lineman and there was, a physical requirement around, you got to be able to lift, say, 100 pounds on a regular basis, that wouldn't be me. Okay? I could not do that job. But if you look at your company's job descriptions and they all say every single one must be able to lift 50 pounds, but it's your job to do data entry and you're not touching anything, is that really going to just automatically disqualify somebody with a disability who couldn't do that? So it really challenged me to go back and look at core job descriptions. And I even looked at my own. It's like, when's the last time I lifted 50 pounds? Like, I didn't. I delegated it to that kid that I hired that was stronger than I was to lug that stuff around. So that really challenged it as well. But we're so stuck in these modes of, well, it's just not going to work out. I'm going to have to make too many accommodations or alterations to my physical environment. And by the way, if your environment is not compatible with ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a tax credit. It's called the Disabled Access Credit. You can go get I think it's up to $10,000 to $15,000 to alter your environment to bring yourself up to speed. So, I mean, I could go on for another hour about all of the myths and misconceptions that employers have.
Maybe we'll do a future show just on that.
Oh, call me.
I'm like, yep, let me know. I'll be there. So we're talking about really fun. I mean, we're talking about systems change at its most fundamental, and it's not just one system. It's a lot of, so I'm hearing there's a whole kind of panoply of attitude changes that need to happen. There are policy changes that need to happen. And I'd love to ask you both a little bit about strategically, how is that work being done right now by disabilities rights advocates and employment first advocates?
Sarah, do you want to go or do you want me to take this one first?
I'll let you take that.
Okay. Right now in Arkansas, and this is part of a national organization, it's called APSE, the Association for People Supporting Employment First. I'm sure you've probably heard of it.
I have
So
indeed.
there you go. So the Arkansas APSE chapter very much believes that employment first would benefit Arkansas greatly, particularly in Arkansas. it would be a benefit because we are actually behind the rest of the country when it comes to people with disabilities being in the workforce. This is from 2019, the statistics I'm about to quote, and this is from the Disability Statistics Compendium. But on average in the United States, a person with a disability is in the workforce 38.8% of the time. In Arkansas, it's 32.8%. 6% gap that we have in the state. If you want to get really granular on that, based on 2019 statistics, that's about 16,300 Arkansans would have to be in the workforce with a disability to bring us up to the rest of the country.
Wow.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's where it all comes from. If we had a piece of legislation that said somebody getting assistance, supported employment help from one of the different entities in the state, whether that be, DHS, DDS, or one of the passes, when they offer that client or member services, if they just ask them, what do you want to do? We could move people into the workforce, just like that. Now, it would be difficult to do it overnight. The governor announced his intent to clear the Medicaid waiver wait list, which is fantastic. And of course, you're talking about direct service professionals. I'm sure Sayred's going to go ahead and address that in a second. If all of those, roughly 3,000 people came off the wait list right now, we don't have enough people to offer them supported employment and the training right off the bat to make them successful. But that would be a significant chunk of that 16,000 people, just like that we could put into the workforce to support.
Well, and I would think that would not represent an insignificant, amount of, for example, increased tax revenue and, allowing people to have purchasing power in communities, and it contribute to the economy of their communities in all kinds of positive ways. No?
Oh yeah, and I mean, you think about it. Even if somebody's say working, I can't do math in my head, but let's say they had somebody with a disability and they were making minimum wage, which in Arkansas is $11 an hour, and they were working 20 hours a week, $220 before taxes. Let's say, $175 after taxes. Well, that's $175 extra dollars that person has to do whatever they want to with. And if you had thousands of people with that, to your point, how much of an economic driver would that be? Or just to have enough supports, personnel around that particular person, even if they just need one person, how many jobs would that create in this state? And how much of an economic engine would that be? And the wonderful thing about those kind of jobs is that they're driven through home and community-based services. It's a decentralized model of employment. So all of those jobs wouldn't necessarily be concentrated in one or two urban areas. They could be all throughout the state, where that person that is there supporting that person in their home could be anywhere. They could be, South Arkansas, the Delta, they could be here in Central, wherever it is in the state. What a job engine that would be on top of that.
So absolutely. So Sarah, switching over to you, it's really kind of the perfect segue. It would be this huge driver. It's so needed. And we're about to have 3,000 some odd people coming off of this waiver list. So the direct support professionals are not there. Talk a little bit about that. First of all, what a direct support professional is, what they do, and what services they provide.
I'd be happy to. I feel like that's I talk about this in my sleep. So I'm happy to do it here. I do want to point out, just backing up just a little bit before we jump into kind of a different focus. Mm-hmm. When we talk about employment first, and we talk about kind of the stuff that's happening and what we're doing, and John's working really closely with APSI and some of those systems levels, just really trying to get to a place where we make it our policy and our practice to talk to folks about work. I also think that the world has an agenda as well, and that the pandemic is a factor right now in the direction that we're going and the work that we're doing. And I think more than ever before, there's a case to be made that there's an entire workforce out there that employers have not tapped into yet. And that's never been more important than it is right now, when we see the hiring challenges that employers from all different segments of our workforce are experiencing. Now is the time, I think, that you can really pique the curiosity of employers who maybe before were so couched in those myths and those misconceptions that it wasn't necessarily, it was John 10 years ago, right? That you just, we're there's no reason to go there. I think today, the universe has given us all a reason to go there more than ever before. And hopefully some of the policy work that we're doing, some of the awareness building work that we've been doing for a really long time can all kind of coalesce around this moment, and we can make some real progress with it. It is the perfect segue, I think, to talk about direct support professionals. I am usually the voice in the room when we get folks that are really driving these conversations about employment first. I'm the one that's saying, and I am here for employment first. I've been here for employment first since the beginning, and we want to continue to drive that, but we're not going to make any progress in that area unless we can make some true change in stabilizing the direct support professional workforce. So direct support professionals are folks that provide those direct services to individuals with disabilities. And direct support professionals currently in the IDDD field do not have a sole distinction, which is a problem for us. So when you talk about direct support professionals and you talk about, you look at national statistics and you look at, you know, we know certain things. We know that the turnover rate in the DSP industry is about almost 50%, that direct support professionals come in to our field and they don't stay. It's a high turnover rate. It's a low reimbursement job. On average, DSPs are making about $13 an hour, just a little more than $13 an hour. But when we talk those numbers, we are oftentimes talking about large segments of direct support professionals. So DSPs across lots of different service fields and support industries. And so we're often talking about CNAs and home health providers, PCAs, even LPNs. Sometimes we're talking about nursing home assistants, and we're talking about you know, folks that are working in human development centers and institutional settings. But the reality is that for home and community-based DSPs, the work is more complex. The work is has an additional layer of challenge, and the duties are more significant oftentimes, but reimbursement is not. Because we lump all of those together, what we see is that we are offering to pay direct support professionals oftentimes entry-level wages, minimum wage, for work that requires them in many instances to be in a one-on-one environment. So they're not working under a roof of an office building with a full team of support and knowledge and access and guidance and instruction there. They are working in people's homes and on their job sites and in their communities, providing one-on-one supports to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and being required to really make decisions about the work and the support and discerning and engaging. I say all the time, DSPs are responsible for interacting with and communicating with every aspect of our society, every aspect. At Arkansas Support Network, we support individuals across the lifespan. And so we have DSPs that are supporting young kids who are engaging with pediatricians around specialized medical services and additional supports that a child may need because of specialized medical conditions. And so our DSPs are the ones that are having to do that communication and that liaison with medical professionals, with educational institutions, and take that back to the home environment, working with families and social service systems, state systems, all of those kinds of things, to make sure that that individual is supported the way that they need to. On the flip side of that, we may have someone that works with an individual who's in the aging process, and our DSPs are liaisons to landlords and to utility services. They're also working with individuals as they learn about prostate screenings and breast exams and all aspects of life and everything in between. We have working relationships, and our DSPs support individuals through grief and loss and end of life planning of their own. There's not an aspect of life that our DSPs don't on some level come in contact with, and are required to provide supports to individuals, to empower individuals, to really network them to be a part of their communities, to value those members, and to really facilitate meaningful lives as defined by those members. Everything is unique and everything is individualized. That's complex, that's complicated, that far exceeds a minimum wage reimbursement, but that's what direct support professionals get reimbursed. Typically, that's our reimbursement structures, as they usually are. In in Arkansas, in DD services, direct support professionals are primarily reimbursed through Medicaid waiver, which today runs through the PASS system. And so the structure for reimbursement is that the state of Arkansas established a rate of reimbursement for passes. Passes get paid a per member per month rate for the services that they provide. And those services include all Medicaid services. So their Medicaid waiver services are just a piece of that. It also, that per member per month rate also covers their medical services, prescriptions, therapies, anything that Medicaid would cover. And then passes establish a set rate. Each of the 4 passes in Arkansas have a different set rate, which is a problem, for supported living services for folks that are receiving Medicaid waiver services. And so providers are reimbursed a set rate for supported living services for each individual, and it's a different rate depending on what pass they're in. None of those rates are set or established to allow for wages of DSPs to drastically exceed minimum wage. And so workforce has historically been an issue for direct support professionals. We have documentation on a national level from the early 90s where reports were calling for a drastic infusion of resources into this workforce in order to be able to maintain. That never came. And fast forward to today, where we have a 30 years long depleted workforce that's now facing the challenges of the workforce crisis that everyone's experiencing in the midst of a pandemic. And we cannot even begin to compete. And so what we're seeing today are providers that are turning folks away from services and supports, that are just not able to support individuals with developmental disabilities in home and community-based services because we do not have the direct support professional workforce to do so. I'm going to take a breath and let you plug in any questions that you have, a certain direction you want me to go.
I heard a lot of different skill sets, some of which require state licensure and continuing education. I mean, like I heard, there are nursing, licensed nursing professionals as part of that constellation. I heard some social work skills in there. I heard all kinds of things that require some type of advanced education, licensure, and continuing education credit in order to maintain licensure. I heard, a lot about, and I guess I'm bringing that up because I have heard this workforce referred to, as unskilled labor. You hear this a lot with childcare too, particularly early childhood education. Those educators have a hard time getting the respect that they deserve, and subsequently the wages that they deserve. But say something about the professionalization of this workforce.
Yeah. So we work really closely with the National Alliance of Direct Support Professionals, which was an organization founded by the Kennedy family, actually, who's long been a supporter and a proponent of legitimizing the direct support professional workforce, and beginning in the early 90s, really ringing the alarm bell that we don't have the resources in place to support this workforce to sustain. And one of the major alarms that people sound that just really resonates with me is that, when we went through the process of deinstitutionalization, really in the 70s, 80s, we were able to deinstitutionalize many people with disabilities on the backs of the home and community-based workforce. Because what we said is we can provide these services better in the community, which is true. I stand by it 1,000,000%. It's absolutely true. But we also said we can provide these services cheaper in the community. And we were in the midst. Medicaid waiver was established in the Reagan administration, where trickle down economics was the driving idea at the time. And so the mentality that this needed to be economical, in order for this to get off the ground, it needed to be a financial win, was a big driving factor. Unfortunately, it's not true. It's not true at all. And here we are all these years later, still driving off of this under-resourced, underfunded workforce. What the folks at NADSP have done a thorough job of the research of what the work is, how complex and complicated the work is, the skill sets that are required. They've begun the process of really establishing a credentialing process that would allow for career laddering. And it's really designed, I mean, it's kind of a simple cut and paste model that looks at nursing, looks at the profession of nursing. If you look at nursing in the 40s, 50s, nurses at that point in time often had some of the same misconceptions that DSPs have today, where the thought process was nurses passed sponges and instruments to people, that was really the complexity of their jobs. In the DSP world, we hear often the misconception that direct support professionals are glorified babysitters. It's your job to show up and make sure nothing absolutely horrible happens, and that's really the only skill set that's necessary. With the nursing profession, nurses were very successful in lobbying and advocating for career laddering, and created a career ladder that starts with a CNA rung and then goes to an LPN and then an RN and then an APN. And by establishing that credentialing ladder, they were able to leverage the reimbursement structures and the resource allocations necessary. And today, your healthcare is provided primarily, probably 95%, by nursing. that MDs have become a much removed part of the everyday execution of healthcare. And it really is all tied back to the advocacy work that was done by nurses to really establish that career laddering. And so for direct support professionals, that is our hope, and that is our goal. And that's a lot of the work that the National Alliance of Direct Support Professionals does now, in really being able to map out, to your point, that this is a complex set of skills. NADSP outlines really a trilogy that's required to do this work well. That it takes skills, it takes knowledge, and it takes ethics, right? That, as with any other profession, that these things are necessary to perform this work well, and to perform at a high quality. And so NADSP has drafted and established a code of ethics for the profession, along with 15 core competencies that good direct support really address and include, that we hope to be able to really serve as the foundation for the legitimization and the professionalization of the field.
This definitely parallels, I mean, I'm a social worker by education and training, and it definitely parallels the efforts to professionalize the field of social work. There's sort of similar laddering, the code of ethics, core competencies, all of that. It's so important. So to both of you, we're headed towards, and I don't think anybody would argue that 3,000 people coming off of the Medicaid waiver waiting list is not a good thing. But also you could look at it as kind of, okay, we're headed towards a cliff. What are some of the efforts that are being undertaken now to try and get some services up under these folks when they come off the list?
So one of the things that we have started the process on is really examining and having an in-depth conversation about Medicaid waiver at a level that quite honestly, I've worked for Arkansas Support Network for 22 years, and of that time, probably 20 of those years were at some level of state or legislative advocacy. And we've never engaged in a conversation around Medicaid waiver services quite the same way that we have in this last really just 6 months since the governor's announcement. It's really given us the ability to kind of dissect what the system currently is, what it does, how it's failing its existing members. I think the governor's announcement, coupled with the pandemic has absolutely been a driving factor in this. And so we are working with Representative Julie Mayberry has really led the conversation in the Arkansas legislature about where are we, what are our needs, how are we serving or not serving existing populations, and where do we need to go. And a couple of exciting initiatives I think are coming out of that. One is Representative Mayberry has reached out to and recruited members of the Arkansas Department of Education and invited them to the table to have conversations around credentialing programs within high schools and some post-secondary institutions and what that looks like. We've actually been looking at a model that the state of Ohio put in place in 2015, in which they offer a DSP credentialing program for high school juniors and seniors that allow those students to become certified direct support professionals, receive a career training credit for that as a part of their high school curriculum, experience an internship, which is a really important piece of that learning process, and then graduate with a certification. And Ohio, it has a law that requires certified DSPs to be reimbursed at a higher rate. So they can graduate high school with a certification into an open position, because we have lots of open positions, and be reimbursed more than that minimum entry level rate. And so I've had the opportunity to participate in some conversations with Representative Mayberry and some of the Ohio and Arkansas education folks. There's a real opportunity that everybody kind of acknowledges to work within our existing systems, even without law change, even without legislation, to be able to make that work on a policy level, which is a super exciting thing. We're also looking at the opportunities that are available through COVID relief. The American Rescue Act allows for states to be able to access additional FMAP money. FMAP is the match, Medicaid match that the federal government provides for Medicaid waiver programs. And so Arkansas has put together a plan that provides for about $120 million to go to home and community-based providers across DD services, aging services, and behavioral health services for the purposes of recruitment and retention. And so that application is actually live. It went live last week, and providers are encouraged to apply for ARPA funds. And those dollars will be pushed out from the state. The state has to spend them by the 31st of this month in order to qualify for that FMAP increase under ARPA. So the state is working really hard on that. We're really excited that plan specifically gives us the ability to offer up to $1,000 recruitment bonuses, to offer a substantial retention bonus over a set time period as defined by that provider. But that money can be used all the way out through 2024. It also allows for a bonus that can be provided to direct support professionals who are supporting individuals who meet a definition of complex care needs. So folks who have additional support needs above and beyond just basic supported living. Those are good starts.
That's amazing. Yeah.
They are good starts, and I'm very encouraged about those things. I also have to make sure that I say over and over again, those are just starts. We are talking about 40 years war here that we're not going to be able to eradicate with a year's worth of competitive recruitment bonuses and still be reimbursing services at a minimum wage level. What has to happen is that we have to fundamentally change the system in which we're operating in.
It's one play in a long game. John, I want to ask you, is this a similar watershed moment for Employment First?
Absolutely. And, as you have all of these people that are finally going to be able to access all of those services, those people that want to work, you've got to get out there and prepare the world of employers how to bring those people into the workforce. And certainly here at the Governor's Council, we've been working closely with Arkansas Rehabilitation Services, but also with the PASS to really look at that process of when you get that person and they need services, are those employers out there ready? Arkansas Rehabilitation Services, we talk about how I was converted in. It was largely the work of ARS that broke through a lot of my prejudice and misconceptions about, hey, you know what? Hiring people with disabilities is a smart business move. So taking that education, those learnings, and those experiences that I've had and sharing those with other businesses, I feel like I have an advantage compared to some other people that I've walked miles in those shoes. Those employers that are resistant and are sitting on the fence and they're, I don't know, it's going to be scary to hire someone with a disability. You know what? I was scared, and literally ARS held my hand through the entire process and made sure that I was successful because they wanted their clients to be successful. And once I understood that, hiring people with disabilities was no big deal. What I'm doing now in my role is working with the PASS and ARS to make sure that we can get out together and start softening the ground in the business community to get them ready to hire people with disabilities and be successful at the beginning.
Little myth busting, little talk about personal experience.
I spent a large part of October, which is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, just going out, talking to different civic groups and letting them know, this is my story. This is how I got from being a naysayer to a believer, to the point where I left the business world to come work for the Governor's Council to teach the rest of you how to do what I did. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's a good business decision. And that's the beauty of it. When you as an employer and as a business and as an organization start hiring people with disabilities and giving them the same chances that everybody else has, and it works out for you, it's one of those rare but beautiful intersections of doing the right thing and making a bottom line decision that's good for your organization. And it's truly a win-win for everybody involved. And you don't get a lot of those in the business universe, but in this instance, you do.
It's a hopeful note to end on. These attitudes did not crop up overnight. They will not be dispelled overnight, but for the sustained work of lots and lots of people, including yourselves. Thank you so much, John Taylor at the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, and Sayard Evans with Arkansas Support Network and the Arkansas Waiver Association. John, if people want to know more about Employment First and how they can help or want to learn more, where would you point them?
Certainly, you can go to the Arkansas APSE website. You can go to the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities website. But more importantly, if you yourself are actually receiving waiver services and you have a pass, talk to your care coordinator. Tell them that you want to work, and they'll start getting to work on that. And if not, I'm working with the passes on how to do that better and how to build relationships with businesses better.
Perfect. We were going to wrap up there. Thank y'all so much for being with us. And thanks to all of you for listening. You can call Disability Rights Arkansas at 800-482-1174 if you need assistance information or your rights are not being respected and you want to talk to somebody. You'll find us online at www.disabilityrights.org. We're also on Facebook at Disability Rights AR and on Twitter at DR Arkansas. Also in the show notes, we'll be linking back. We've been talking a lot about the Medicaid waiver. I will link back to the show that we did back in December for more foundational information on the Medicaid waiver waiting list, what the governor is planning to do and how that's going to go down. That's it. That's as fast as I can talk. I'm Carrie Michael. Thanks so much for joining us on Speak Up Arkansas, KABF 88.3 FM.